And welcome back. We are going to kind of wrap a couple things up here with our introduction to pixel by first talking about the fallacy of raster images. Most images that we have been working with are what are known as raster images. So things such as JPEGs, PNGs, and even how we work with Photoshop are all raster images. They're not vector images, which will keep their dimensions and scaling based upon whatever size you set them at. Raster images are really good for things like pixel art. However, they do have drawbacks, and I'm going to show that here specifically with the idea of scaling. Now, up to this point, when we worked with our pineapple, we started with 8 by 8, went to 16 by 16, and then we went to 32 by 32. And each time we had to redraw those images. Now, Photoshop does have a tool in it which allows us to reset the image size. So just to start to show how this fallacy exists, let's go ahead and just look at this as a PNG. So this is a PNG of our image, and I'm going to go ahead and go to image size, and I'm going to make sure this is in pixels, and notice right now it's 32 by 32. But let's just take that image and drop it down to, let's say, a 16 by 16 image. And if we look at this 16 by 16 image, this is our pineapple that we just did, and compare that to the pineapple that we created here. These, even though are both 16 by 16, are not similar. In fact, this looks, I would say, much worse. Now, the reason for that is because Photoshop, when you scaled that image down, had to make a best guess as to what those pixels correspond to. So if I undo this real quick and take it back to toggle last state, oh, here's our image. We, of course, can look and see that this image here is not the same. All right. When we went ahead and redid that image size, we lost a lot of quality in that image. And a lot of the shading here that exists in these different gradients is done by Photoshop making a best guess. Now, let's look at this from the 8 by 8 image. And this is where I see this happen more with students, is they try to take something smaller and make it bigger. So I'm going to go ahead and use the image size on this as well. So here's our 8 by 8, and let's take this again to the 16 by 16. So we're effectively doubling the image size. And when I hit Control 0, you can see here's our image. And this, if anything, looks even worse than when we took the 32 by 32 and scale that. Let's just go ahead and just redo the image size in this one. This, if anything, looks even worse than when we took this one. And the reason for that is because here it had less information to work with. When we had an 8 by 8 image, it had less information, so Photoshop had to make even more guesswork. Whereas here, we had a 32 by 32, so it had more information available to it, and we could make a higher quality image. Now this, of course, is not just limited to PNGs. Let's see the same effect happen now with our Photoshop document. So the PSD file is a Photoshop document file. And so let's go ahead and do the same thing here. I'm going to take my 32 by 32, and let's go ahead and use our image size here to scale this down to 16 by 16. Now you can see, of course, it's going to be identical to kind of what we have here because it's the same image. So it affects it the exact same way. It doesn't really matter necessarily in the file format. And if we do the 8 by 8, we're going to see the same thing. You can see that the image has, again, scaled exactly the same because, again, it's Photoshop in this case trying to make the best guess. So if you ever have to scale something, scaling down is always a better option than scaling up. Scaling up, you can see, makes a much worse result. In fact, if I had looked at this and you asked me what kind of fruit this is, I would be hard pressed to guess that it is a pineapple. I probably would say something more like it's an orange or some kind of citrus than that it is a pineapple. Whereas if we look at this original image here, yeah, I could argue that's a pineapple. So let's just undo this here. There's our pineapple. There's our higher quality pineapple. But you can see really quickly, though, why we do not want to use the image size feature to recreate our pixel art. Again, this is a tool that exists. It can come in handy, sometimes when you want, for example, to scale down, but when you want to scale up, it is definitely something you want to avoid. Because when I scaled that image down, you can see we still have some semblance to a pineapple. However, if we look at our thumbnail, it looks kind of blurry. Now, we had a 64 by 64 image. We could maybe end up with something that was more in line with what we were hoping for a 16 by 16 because we'd have even more information. Generally speaking, the bigger the image, the more information you have present, the better job something like Photoshop or any other image editing tool can use to scale down. Scaling up is not necessarily a good thing unless you're looking to make something blurry on purpose, because again, it's going to make its best guess. So whenever we're working with pixel art here and we want to make an image in a different size, it is always going to be in our best practice to redraw that image rather than trying to use scaling tools. Hello, future me cutting in here to add something into this video that I forgot to mention previously. I know I had talked about using image size to scale an image, and I did mention the fallacy of scaling. However, I did forget to point out that Photoshop does have other resampling methods available to it. So for example, if I do preserve details enlargement and I do 64 by 64 and I zoom that out, you can see how it has changed that pineapple a little bit different. However, if I want that pineapple to be a little bit different, such as nearest neighbor, hard edges, this is what's going to kind of try to preserve those pixels as best it can. So I'm going to go ahead and now let's do that 64 by 64 again. Nearest neighbor, hit OK. And you can see that it has largely preserved the pineapple that we had before. In fact, it pretty much just doubled effectively each of them. Now, what would happen though is if I scale this down, we can still run into some issues. So let's do 16 by 16. Click OK. And you can see that our pineapple has largely been preserved in terms of its form. You can see that it is relatively the same shape and size, and our pixels have not been distorted the same way that they would have been had we used the other image settings that we looked at, such as automatic, or if we had used any of these other ones. Hard edges is the best option that you can use to kind of keep a lot of those pixels the way that we want them to be. So if you're trying to resize, you can use hard edges. However, sometimes it is, while it does work to scale up, it doesn't always work perfect. Now remember, it's still Photoshop taking its best guess. And right now we, of course, are preserving kind of our ratio. This can, of course, look a little bit more skewed. So for example, if I were to do, let's say, a 40 by 40, you can see how it might change. All right. So this is things where if you are keeping the same ratio of the image, so like 32 by 32 to 64 by 64, works great. But if you're doing like 32 by 32 to a 40 by 40, it's not the same ratio, and we can end up with weird artifacts such as you can see here.